everybody. This is Stephanie Ruper. Thank you so much for tuning into the Naked Humanity podcast, where we try to figure out what it means to be human in the modern world. Today is episode number 50, and I have on Hugo Drochon, a specialist in political thought. And specifically today, we talk about Friedrich Nietzsche and how his political thought can reflect on the modern world. Now, that's a mouthful, but an important mouthful. Nietzsche is probably a name you've heard before. If you haven't, maybe you've heard the phrase, God is dead. Nietzsche is famous for having said, God is dead. Now, of course, when Nietzsche says this, and we'll talk about this at length in the podcast, he's not saying he wants God to die or he hates the idea of God. He's diagnosing a cultural problem, a cultural happening that I talk about on the podcast quite a lot. And this is what we have discussed as the decline or the death of a singular religious narrative. Up until the 1500s, pretty much everybody across Europe assented to Christianity, a reasonably uniform one, at least much more uniform than we know today. None of the Protestant sects existed at all. And so people's sense of right and wrong, of where truth comes from, of what might happen when you die, of how to make sense of the world were generally the same. Now, of course, there were differences, but they were rooted in the same narrative, in the same worldview, in the same understanding. Now that changed a lot. And by the time culture rolled around to Nietzsche, nobody had yet really seen it as being really impactful, but Nietzsche said, wow, look at what has happened to our society. Look at how different we are. Look at what has happened to our values, to our purpose, to how we make sense of things, to our understanding of right and wrong. It has completely changed. We now choose our values or have the ability to choose our values. And this is massive. This is huge. And Nietzsche had so much else to say, and it's very complicated and important, and we'll dive into it in the podcast today. There are very keen insights into how people relate to one another, into competing interests of social groups that reflects on things that we have today, like the resurgence of fascism and identity politics and coping with a quote unquote secular world or a diverse spiritual landscape and effects on democracy. All of these things are very related to what was going on at Nietzsche's time as well. And Nietzsche happened to be really smart and to have a lot to say that was important for those times, and which can help us understand our times, what's happening to us today as well. So that's what I have Hugo on today to discuss, and he's brilliant, and it's a lovely conversation. I'm very excited about it. I'll read you a little bit about Hugo, Professor Drochon, before we get going. Hugo Drochon is a political theorist and historian of modern political thought with interests in continental political philosophy, democratic theory, liberalism, and political realism. His book, Nietzsche's Great Politics, came out with Princeton University Press in 2016. It was reviewed in the TLS, New Statesman, Times Higher Education, Notre Dame, Philosophical Reviews, Dissent, and the LARB, and featured in interviews with Vox and the Irish Times. It was selected as one of Choice's outstanding academic titles for 2017 and longlisted for the Bronislaw Jeremic First Academic Book Prize. Hugo's current research is on elite theories of democracy and their impact this thinking had on the development of democratic theory in the US and Europe after World War II. He has a book entitled Elites and Democracy under contract with Princeton University Press. I'm really looking forward to that book. I think this is all very important. And, on this podcast, we spend a lot of time unpacking the human condition, unpacking religion, unpacking psychology. Not often do I get to put this in a political context, and especially to see the overlap between these what we might call spiritual and political movements, conundrums, phenomena, what have you. So this is a fascinating podcast, especially if you're into politics in today's world and trying to make sense of, everything that's unfolding in this, kind of baffling era. So thank you so much for tuning in. I have links to everything in the show notes. You can contact me or Hugo if you have any questions, and we would love to hear them. So thank you so much for tuning in. Without further ado, here is historian Professor Hugo Drochon. Okay, hi, welcome Hugo.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. I was just giggling because we're going to talk about Nietzsche today, and Nietzsche is one of my favorite topics of conversation. I don't expect that's a particularly common thing. Is Nietzsche also like fun for you, or having worked on Nietzsche for ages, it's sort of, work, play sort of
Uh,
thing?
yeah, it's a good question, actually. Yeah, I guess it's true. You kind of, as an academic, you do the PhD, you get your first book out, and it's true. Then you want to move on, but I think Nietzsche. No, he's so kind of enthralling that there might be an element that becomes, well, there's the academic work or the scholarly work, and that gets manifested as one thing, i.e., something like a scholarly book. But there's
Hmm.
all the rest.
Yeah.
So that never goes away. And in any case, as you're probably more than aware, Nietzsche never seems to be particularly far from any kind of news anyway. So it's always kind of there. No, so no, I don't have that kind of burnout of Nietzsche, and I don't never want to talk about him again. No, not at all. And I know that in the future it's something that I'll come back for in terms of my own work also in the future. But try to do a bit of different things in the meantime also.
So you're in history? You're a historian technically?
I'm in the politics department. There's
Politics.
this slightly strange thing of doing the history of political thought where sometimes you're caught between two stools. But I'm currently in the politics department. Yes.
I see. Okay. Yeah. I'm in a religion department where you're basically
Okay.
allowed to do whatever you want. So,
Good.
um, yeah. So, okay. That's wonderful. And I have given a little bit of a primer to
Yeah.
listeners on Nietzsche. But
Okay.
I'm wondering if you could tell us, usually I think in popular culture, Nietzsche's sort of depicted as a bad guy. So can you tell us a little bit about maybe that perception and why that might be wrong, and why you like him?
Yeah, I think it goes both ways because I also have, what is the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind? There's all these kind of like, there's the Nietzsche who's this, yeah, that the teenagers, especially in American culture, that, people associate with him and they're anxious and whatever. So in popular culture, I think you get a bit of both. You get the kind of like Nietzsche angst kind of self, but like the positive, which is a lot of self-creation, kind of be yourself. And then it's true, obviously, that politically it often kind of gets recuperated by certain more extreme. And obviously, right now, the kind of most prominent example of that is the alt right, Richard Spencer, who claims to have been red pilled by Nietzsche. So that often comes out. So I think it's funny, you get a bit of both, but it's true that the politics often seems to fall onto the bad side. Um, yeah, and I think that was one of the reasons. I mean, I don't know, for a lot of people, I think when they read, and perhaps this was your experience too, when you read Nietzsche for the first time, for me, it was just intellectual fireworks. I remember I was in a library. I was an undergraduate in Trinity College, Dublin. And I remember reading whatever, and I don't even remember exactly the text, but it was just kind of fireworks. And so much so that I had to actually get up and leave the library and go for a walk to kind of clear out. It was just so taking. And then from that point on, it's always really stayed with me. But the question, because I was really taken by Nietzsche, and I think there's always this enthralling element. It's kind of very intoxicating, the writing, and that has its difficulties and problems too. And there's often a sense that, you get the sense that Nietzsche writes for you. He's writing for you individually. So it's very hard not to respond to that type of call. And I'm probably guilty of that as much as anyone else. But it did, because I was also interested in politics. It's like, okay, well, also, like, there's all these amazing insights clearly into psychology, into history, into what's going on in the world, what exactly is going on with Nietzsche about politics. And that then became my kind of the line that I wanted to pursue, because I read a lot of books and where I was trying to find the answer to that question, and none of them really satisfied me. That led me in a certain direction. It led me in terms of the work that I've done, for Nietzsche, at least for now. And then anyway, and part of it was also to try to respond. I mean, Richard Spencer kind of came about after I'd done this work, but it's how it often comes up. And either you seem to have the choice that either you say, Nietzsche is just a philosopher, he's not interested in politics, so you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Or the option is, it's politics and it's bad and it's the bad Nietzsche or whatever. And I was like, well, is there something, is there a link between the two, philosophy and politics, that doesn't, on the one hand, say there's no politics, on the other hand, fall into the bad politics? And that, I think, was the work that I was trying to do, at least.
Right. And I deeply appreciate that about your work. And I actually, while I was doing my master's degree, read a bunch of Nietzsche and surrounding thinkers. And we always talked about it. We were scholars of religion, and if scholars of religion always kind of knew that scholars of religion liked what Nietzsche had to say, or at least thought it was important. But there was one political scientist in our class who the whole time was just appalled that we were considering reading Nietzsche in this way. But also upon engaging it, was like, oh, okay, I sort of see this. And I think, Nietzsche is often associated with anti-Semitism, which is a part of, I think, your association with Richard Spencer. But that was sort of given to his work after, right? That wasn't his work. It was sort of laced on top of it or through it by other people.
I think the honest answer to that is there is a bit of anti-Semitism in it, at least in the early work. Whether that's his own, whether he's just kind of reproducing certain stereotypes and certain prejudices of the time. And the certain prejudices of the time might go, at least certain people have made the argument that you see that throughout his work. But certainly at the beginning, there seems to be quite a bit of anti-Semitism, whether it's his own or whether it's under the influence of Wagner, who was a notorious anti-Semite. That's unclear, and I think he's partially guilty to that. But it's true that over then time, he himself describes himself as an anti-Semite. And then when he's talking about anti-Semitism, it's like everything. There's a bit of subtlety. I think the only ones he just dismisses out of hands actually are the English, where he just thinks they're completely and utterly uninteresting. But most of the other people, there's different elements. So there's some in his account, if you can use this type of language, there are good Jews, there's bad Jews, etc. Some of these fall back into stereotypes, but he certainly included some of them in the vision that he was projecting as to what he wanted to happen. So his ideal kind of good European, the good European of the future, was meant to be literally a marriage of two different people. One of them was the Prussian kind of military aristocracy on the one hand, and the other one, the European Jew. That was what he thought was the future. And that it was because on the one hand, and so this is where you could say, is this anti-Semitic, yes or no? Or it falls into stereotypes. On the one hand, you had the military officer who could command and was disciplined, and that was good. And then on the other hand, you had the European Jew was international, obviously kind of anti-Christian also in the way that Nietzsche was anti-Christian. But that was, and he literally wanted to bring those two groups of people together, and often also what he meant by that is that they would reproduce. And that was his ideal future, which you could see straight away is very, very far than any type of purity or anything like that. So it depends how you parse that out. And of course, what we do know afterwards is that, because he goes mad in 1889, at the beginning of 1889, and we know that then his sister kind of takes over, and she has a definite slant in terms of how she wants to present it. And she compiles that edition, controversial edition, we all know, The Will to Power. But one of and she was married to a virulent anti-Semite, Bernhard Foster, who had set up an Aryan colony in Latin America. I never exactly remember it. I think it might be in Paraguay. It still exists, actually. The name Germania still exists in that area, and it's a completely mixed kind of area now, ironically, and quite. But the two of them, Nietzsche and his sister, were quite close when they were younger. They fell out over that marriage when he was like, you can't marry this guy, he's a complete anti-Semite, blah, 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 blah. And she's like, no. And they had quite a falling out. They still kind of spoke with one another, but the relationship went really cold after that, whereas before they were quite close. So obviously, and he had denounced his brother-in-law basically for being an anti-Semite. So, there are certain powerful elements to it there. And then obviously you get the end when his sister takes it over again and she tries to recreate this myth. She welcomes, Hitler to the Nietzsche archives she set up in Weimar, gives him a walking stick. So there's this type of, and then you get associated with all this kind of Nazi thing. But obviously when you deep down in Nietzsche, it's like a lot of things, it's much more subtle. I think there's strong anti-Semitic claims, at least, even though he seems a bit kind of maybe falling into prejudices, reproducing prejudices at the time, and also then specifically linked to Wagner at the beginning.
Cool. That is very elucidating.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think that's extremely important. And we all stories are important to tell on the podcast. And Nietzsche, I think so many people don't even we don't have a nuanced understanding, but it's a figure that we have at least a little bit in our public consciousness. So I think that detail is important. But that being said, what is it then that is, and feel free to elaborate forever, because this is a very big question. What is it about Nietzsche's view on politics that is important for us to understand today? Why does it matter?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different ways to kind of approach that. I think the first is surely we're interested in Nietzsche because we think that he kind of captures and gives us certain insights into the world we still live in today. I think these ideas about the death of God, resentment, etc., still seems to capture the world and even elements of politics that we have today. So then, if that's their starting point, then trying to figure out then what Nietzsche, if Nietzsche said anything about politics, what were his kind of insights, what were his developments, becomes quite important. Because otherwise, if we don't do that, then it becomes the other thing, which is that, well, Nietzsche's politics can't just be anything. And then you fall back into the problem, well, it could be, yes, and he's been interpreted lots and lots of different ways, for sure. And, we tend to think of, the bad far-right Nietzsche, but at the beginning of the 20th century, it was much more, it was often Marx and Nietzsche that were put together as like Marx gave you the structural understanding of the world, and Nietzsche then gave you this will to power to kind of rise up and overthrow the bourgeois order. So it was considered much more left-wing, and you have these swings that go over the course of time. But if you don't, so on the one hand, is there ways of linking his clear insights that we all recognize with an understanding of politics? And on the other hand, in doing so, not letting the coast clear for any types of kind of interpretations, including the types of ones that we get from the Nazis or Richard Spencer's. If we don't think that's true and valid, then we have to go on that terrain, try to see what Nietzsche is saying about politics, precisely to push back on an empirical basis, but at least on a philological kind of reading of Nietzsche. Everyone has their interpretation, but Nietzsche does say certain things about politics. So that is a starting point that we can kind of build on and see exactly where that brings us.
Sure. So you mentioned these things he says about politics, and you mentioned resentment. You mentioned the death of God. Perhaps I find the death of God particularly important, but again, that's my religion. That's my religion perspective. But what was this idea, and why is it so important?
Yeah, and I also agree. I think this is one of the most fundamental things. The idea is to say, okay, perhaps, you have to put Nietzsche back in his context. His late 19th century, as we know, he's a son of a pastor. So there's a strong religious kind of influence basis there. And his basic claim is to say that, the whole world, or at least that kind of Germanic European world at the time, was organized around certain organizing principles, which had to do with Christianity and certain understandings of Christianity. And that had kind of fallen away over time. And therefore, the unique rooted transcendentalism that was offered is gone. And now you have lots of different interpretations, a lot of different ways you can think about life. And that's the challenge of 20th century or after the 20th century onwards, is this diversity, whereas before it was much more anchored in people that is shared, although interpretations obviously differed, with a shared kind of moral understanding of how people should live and what type of lives they should have. Once that foundation is eroded and starts giving way, then all these other questions that had been kind of put to bed, as in what type of humanity should we be? Because we had an answer with Christianity, we should be Christians, right? That was the answer. No, we debate as to what we mean by that, but we're meant to be Christians. Once that's gone, well, what are we? I mean, it just completely and utterly opens up the question again. And I think that's what Nietzsche was trying to deal with the death of God. And there's one step further, because we often talk about the death of God, but there's another kind of element to it, which is the shadows of God, which I think is very interesting, where the idea is that even though God is dead, i.e. people no longer believe in God or this transcendental kind of thing that's meant to unify us, we still continue to live as if God existed. So we continue to in that life that we had before without the kind of foundational basis for it. And it's those types of people, I think, that Nietzsche really wanted to kind of needle and say, look, you got to think about this more seriously. You can't just go on as if nothing happened. He wanted to challenge those people. And he said, because there's an opportunity here. There's a danger, of course, but there's an opportunity. And there's an opportunity perhaps to have other types of lives outside of just the one type of life we've had so far. We have more diverse types of lives. And some of those types of lives may be richer or haven't been able to express themselves to the maximum possibility because they're being constrained by Christian morality. And so that was something he really wanted to push forward and push people to try to explore more, with all the dangers that went with it. And I think that's the one thing that's important to keep in mind with Nietzsche. I think he did have this kind of view, that quite an elitist view probably, is that this type of self-creation was probably available to a certain group of people, but not to everybody, and that it was okay for the majority of people to continue as if God still existed. And maybe they still believe in God, and that's fine, but not everybody did. And so it's the classic distinction you get between, the masters and the slaves, or the master and the herd, right? The herd, if they want to continue living these types of lives, fine, maybe they still believe in, and it suits them and it's good for them, but they cannot say that they're the only type of life possible. There are other types of lives. And now that God is dead, we can explore these. And maybe lots of wonderful things will come of that hadn't been possible before. That's what we should try to explore.
Yeah, I find that to be particularly important. I think of one major misconception about Nietzsche is people think he is against God or personally trying to kill God, but that's not the case, right? It's more of a diagnosis. This is something that's happened to our culture. And I spend a lot of time personally thinking about the implications for spirituality. I have spent less time thinking about the implications of politics, right? And so how does that influence, say, the way Nietzsche thought about politics, or what he thought, right? Because he was sort of predictive, what he thought might happen or should happen.
Yeah, so that's a big question. And I think there's a bit of creativity probably that needs to go into there too. But if you do follow the line about, okay, well, the distinction between this master and slave morality, which is one of his bigger kind of interpretative points also, and you're absolutely right. It's not that he wants to kill God. He thinks God has died and he's been killed. He does have, like, in Zarathustra, he talks about the man who killed God, right? It's not him, it's other people. So, but I think, and continuing what you mentioned here about the diagnosis, I think that master and slave morality gives you the ability to diagnose, and he used it to diagnose the society within he lived, and then on that basis try to think, well, what would a society based no longer on slave morality or slave morality or herd morality, but instead based on master morality, what would that look like in the future? There are historical examples of more master morality type of societies, the ancient Greeks being some examples, obviously the Renaissance Italy. So if you take history as being sometimes, and it's always a question of degree rather than absolutism, sometimes mass morality dominates a bit more, sometimes it's slave morality. He looked at Bismarck, for instance, the greatest political figure of his time, completely and utterly. I mean, Nietzsche's whole productive life maps itself perfectly onto Bismarck's realm. And he himself participates in the Franco-Prussian War, which is the basis then of German unification and German great power. But he describes that as basically, all the stuff that's related to Bismarck, even though Bismarck calls this, great politics or power politics. It's actually slave morality and petty politics, nationalism, Philistinism, fragmentation of Europe. All these things are examples of slave morality. Therefore, what would rather a master morality politics look like? And he does suggest these things. And the good Europeans we mentioned earlier on are an example of these people who are meant to lead this type of great politics, where instead of Philistinism, mediocrity, nationalism, you have instead of Europeanization, high culture. There is questions about the role that democracy plays in this. That's also it's very interesting and more subtle, as one would expect with Nietzsche, than the usual kind of presentations that you get in it. So that's the vision he seems to offer. And it is linked to the death of God, because that reopens those questions. The idea being that, this new European construct, which aims to high culture, might open the possibility to new types of forms of existence and life that weren't able before. So that's how it links death of God, slave master morality, to analysis of his own time, to then what the future might actually hold.
And so to put that just in a grounded context, would Nietzsche have been excited about the idea of a European Union, right? Would he have wanted states to aggregate? That's kind of one of the questions I try to explore a bit in the book. Certainly, European unification was certainly something he was very interested in, and he did hark back to some of the examples of it. Like I was like, well, Napoleon, there were these certain moments of it too, and there is a broader history of which type of European Union there should be. Whether the EU as we have it today would have been exactly his idea, I'm not entirely sure. I don't think the type of high culture he was advocating is necessarily the aim of what the EU is today, which seems to be, at least in its foundational ideas, more to do with economics, etc. But you could see how there are elements that he would have welcomed. For sure, it's coming together. Yes, that was something positive. The
I mean, the idea also, because this was very prominent in his time, the nationalism of Germany, for instance, that the EU has been able to kind of channel that at least, or kind of keep it under wraps to a certain degree. I think he would have welcomed those types of things. And whether, because then there is a question of what is the relationship between philosophy and politics. There's a relationship between the two in Nietzsche, but it doesn't mean that they're the same. So often I think the idea of Nietzsche is that a certain type of politics will lead to, or will give the possibility for a certain type of philosophy. It's not predetermined, but in certain types of political foundations allow certain types of philosophy or culture, or whatever you might want to call it, to come about. And so even though the EU doesn't necessarily has that as its actual aim, does it allow for kind of more European creation, more European exchange? For instance, the Erasmus scheme is very, very important. I think he would have completely and utterly welcomed that. And academically, research-wise too. We all know the European research grants are some of the biggest things now. Whether it's led to European high culture, it's hard to judge, but there are certain elements of it for sure that I think that he would have welcomed.
I am curious about his sort of injunctions to be you, to be your own individual, to overcome yourself, right? Be your overman. How this sort of focus on individualism would mesh with something that seems nationalistic, right? There's a drive for unification on one hand, but also a drive for individualization. How do those sort of sit in the same space?
Yeah, I think, So Nietzsche is quite critical of nationalism. He was really critical of nationalism in his time and with Bismarck. So that's for sure. And that injunction to be yourself is there. But going back to what I was saying earlier, I think that injunction doesn't necessarily, I don't think Nietzsche thought that this was going to apply to everybody. And so the question goes back to, that ratio between the structure and the content, which is, does the political structure allow certain groups of people to try to develop and be themselves in a way they might not have been able to do so beforehand? That's maybe kind of an empirical question today when you look at the different systems. But it's certainly true, the EU, of course, there are nationalist forces operating within it. We both work in a country where that seems to have taken over slightly too much in terms of what's happening in Brexit at the moment, where it seems very nationalistic driven. And it would be, obviously, then that causes challenges to the European kind of order. But then, on the continent, is there that possibility has the EU opened up a possibility that wasn't there perhaps beforehand for people to develop and become who they are? Maybe. I think that's hard to say exactly, but maybe it has. And if it has, then that certainly seems to be going in a direction I think Nietzsche would have wanted to go.
So this, then when we look at the rise of fascist movements throughout the 20th century and sort of what we might see as a mirroring of that today, that's also reflected in this critique of the nationalistic mentality. And I think you can, some people have tried to draw, Bismarck's Germany had a to Nazi Germany, et cetera, the militarism that starts with Bismarck, which isn't really there actually beforehand. Before, Germany was a land of poets and scholars, right? And all of a sudden, it's the militaristic Germany that's taken over. And Nietzsche is very critical of that, precisely, of saying, look at the move. Who do we consider to be German? What was the stereotype of the German beforehand? And how has that changed? And I think you had in our previous kind of exchange, you'd suggested, is there a link between fascism, for instance, and the death of God? Is fascism and these types of things, as they've often been called, secular religions, right? That they compensate for what's been lost. And that seems absolutely the case. The transcendentalism that was there, that's been lost with the death of God, it's replaced by other things, the nation, nationalism, fascism, or whatever. And Nietzsche, although obviously he never experienced the 20th century, the basis for his critique and his analysis is there through everything he says in terms of his critique of slave morality and the politics of his day. And obviously, his whole aim was to say, the death of God, the answer to that is not to try to go back in time and try to recreate a God, a kind of a transcendental, like top-down kind of God. The challenge now, and that famous scene in the Gay Science where the man comes into the square with a lighted torch and asks, where is God? And everybody asks.
everybody laughs at him and then he leaves disappointed, it's because, and then you have this long passage afterwards. He says, well, our challenge now is we have to become our own gods, in a sense that we have to give ourselves these new values, and we have to figure out what is that going to be. So I'm saying that because instead of falling back into fascism, the thing was, well, can we move forward? And that's I think one might say, well, is fascism a new type of value? Yes, it is, clearly. But then the question is it more on the side of slave morality or master morality? And clearly the idea of Nietzsche was that this was going to be much more pluralistic, which is not really, I think, what you get with, and there's lots of different elements also of fascism, of Nazism that you can critique, the purism of Nazism that Nietzsche had no time for. That was the wrong direction to take it. It was going back in time, falling back into resentment towards time and what had happened. Whereas Nietzsche's injunction was to try to go forward into something new, to look at new horizons. That's the kind of phrases that he uses. But that's very difficult, and it's very demanding. And so you can see the temptation is always to go back. And it's a temptation we see that's coming back again today. That's probably taken over slightly our own politics at the moment too.
Right. This search for this thing, for these sets of values, for what have you, right? Where is God? There is a sense in which, yes, an individual might choose to say, well, you know what, I don't need that. I can create my own values, what have you. But that's not sustainable for millions of people, right? For large groups of people. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing. So there's a sense in which we cannot, all of us collectively, realize a project that he has said we must do. And we still haven't been able to find something that will satisfy us in the wake of the death of God, right?
Yeah, but I think the way Nietzsche thinks about it in the future is that there'll probably be two different spheres of existence. As I said kind of earlier on, his point was not to say we need to completely and utterly destroy Christianity for his own time. The point was to say that we want to push back in Christianity its absolutist claims, to say it's not the only morality possible. There might be other moralities on the side that might be worth exploring too. And so the majority of people, I think Nietzsche would have been quite happy for the majority of people to continue living their lives that way if they thought that was the best way to go. And it's not just if they thought the best way to go. Is that the way to think about Nietzsche is that he thinks that both have a role to play. There's the kind of stabilizing factor of having those who are more associated with the herd, if you want to continue with that language, and the kind of destabilizing factor for those who are going to try to create something else. But you need a bit of both. They're kind of mutually constitutive in a certain way. You can't just have one or the other. If you have one, it's too stable, the other, it's unstable. So the real challenge, I think, that Nietzsche starts to see and does try to articulate through certain ideas like the pathos of distance, for instance, is what is the relationship between those two groups going to be in the future? That's the real challenge. And can they both find a way of kind of living together and then offering something to one another? There's that fundamental idea perhaps with Nietzsche that, it's only as an aesthetic phenomena that life is worth living. This new kind of elite of the future, this new cultural elite, perhaps they can create new types of justifications for existence that would satisfy it, or maybe not. But the challenge of politics there seems to be figuring out what the relationship between those two groups is going to be. And that's not, it's not too far from a lot of the challenges that liberal democracies kind of face today. There's lots of different groups who want lots of different things. And the challenge is how to make sure they are able to coexist in a way that they're all satisfied, more or less, and doesn't deteriorate. And, that's exactly the type of challenge I think we're facing again today. Nietzsche had his own perspective on it, and he thought, this is what's important to try to maintain from it. But the challenge as such, I think, remains the same. And I think Nietzsche was one of actually the first persons probably to see it from the perspective of the 19th century going forward.
Right. So the challenge, I think what you're saying is the challenge was perceived. He perceived it then, and it has changed forms, but has essentially, the challenge has remained the same. Yeah.
Yes. How do you make different groups who have different values kind of able to coexist in not necessarily a harmonious whole, I mean, conflict is not necessarily a bad thing, right? And Nietzsche's probably on that side, a bit of tension between different groups. That's the idea. A bit of tension is productive, and that's good, and keeps everybody on their toes. He had a tendency to divide into two groups of people: the masters, or whatever you call it, and the herd. Today, we probably want to expand that out much more, but the fundamental tension between the two, I think, is there. He had a view as to what that would serve. Not everybody has to agree with that today, but I think fundamentally, that tension is there. That is the tension our societies face, because that's naturally going to come about after the death of God, when you're going to have multiple pluralism, in essence, where you're going to have multiple kind of views as to what the good is and what is morality and what type of life people should be leading. Then you're faced, that's the consequence of the death of God. And then you're faced with these types of questions and these types of political questions, which Nietzsche in his own time was trying to identify and trying to give certain answers to, and also, I think especially, give the analytical tools to try to understand what was going on. And through those, being able to pinpoint the dangers precisely of falling back into wanting to fall back into the old world, which was always going to be a very coercive and violent demand, because that old world was gone. So you're reimposing the old world on a new, and trying to point towards what the new world may be able to offer that didn't exist in the old world.
That's very interesting to me. That's something actually that I'm constantly doing with my audience, and they're probably sick of me talking about it. But I'm constantly saying there's no going back, right? And even attempts to recapture what once was will be happening in this context in which things have become radically plural, right? Have become, in a sense, relativized, right? And you have to choose your own values even if you don't want to. And that's really, I think that's really hard. And that's fundamentally unique, that even if you don't want to choose your own values, you have to. And I think there's maybe something that's inherently stressful about that. Even we don't think about it today because it's just a natural part of our condition, but it is kind of new.
Yeah, I think, that's probably right. I think Nietzsche would be slightly more cynical than you and say, well, most people just go along and do what other people tell them to do. And, that's how they live their lives, and that's fine. I think, there are other people who do ask themselves these questions. And I think he would like to say, well, that's a good thing. And then maybe these people are going to come up with different answers that we haven't heard before. Obviously, we don't need to be Nietzsche to think that, a lot of them are not going to be that interesting. But, some of them might come through that weren't thought of before. And I think clearly our societies have changed quite a bit from his own time. I don't know if for the better or for the worse, but there's definitely a lot more kind of going on. And seems to be a lot more options today than there might have been in his time. And just from a perspective of diversity, that's hopefully a good thing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the Nietzschean perspective that most people will just go along and not actively question, pre-given values or what have you. But I think they occur in this context, right? Yeah. They occur in a context in which that other people believe other stuff, right? You know that other people have different ideas about what's good and what's bad. So I see that as sort of fundamentally altering, everything that we do. But it's impossible to know if it would have been better if we all assented to the same narrative. Like you said, we don't know if it's different. We don't know if it's better.
Yeah, we don't know. And your point, I think, is well taken, that it's obviously a kind of an extra stress that perhaps didn't exist before. It puts a certain amount of pressure. And I think, there's a realization of that in Nietzsche. It's like, things have changed and things are going to be more difficult. And for the majority of people, maybe that will be more difficult. But it would be a shame not to take this opportunity. I think that's the main. I think that has to be one of the points. Take this opportunity because it hasn't been offered before, and maybe we can try something new. And we don't, the whole thing with Nietzsche is that, well, we don't know what that new thing is, and obviously we can't predetermine what that new thing is going to be because that would be counterproductive. Mm-hmm. But it's there, and the point is to try to seize it. And also, I think the important thing is, because I think you mentioned individualism earlier on, is that Nietzsche, there's often this view of Nietzsche that this is kind of, it's the wander on the top of the hills on their own, doing their own thing. But for Nietzsche, this is when you actually see what he says, and even the term that he uses. We talk about good Europeans. It's a plural. It's supposed to be there's supposed to be a communal kind of aspect. People will come together and try to create new types of lives. So of course, some of them might go on their own, but But to think it's only about one individual, then just is ubermensch, like one person who are, ubermensch, depending on how you translate it, can be over humanity, right? It's humans. It doesn't have to be man. One as in one man. It doesn't. In fact, that's probably a mistranslation of it. It's ugly in English, but it's over humanity, overcoming humanity. So that's not one person. That's a lot of people together. And so the communal aspect, I think, is important and sometimes overlooked. Which means that going back to your point about these different stresses. Yes, there are all these different stresses, and individuals get challenged perhaps in a way that they hadn't before. But there are then these opportunities and these different communities that you can go to that can offer you different ways of trying to explore yourself and figure out who you are. And the question is, what's the relationship between those communities and the other communities, and how do you try to navigate that?
Right. So you have a book on Nietzsche that recently came out. Can you remind me what it's called?
It's called Nietzsche's Great Politics. It came out in hardback in 2016 and paperback 2018. And the point was, the great politics comes from Bismarck, which is große Politik, right? That was his great politics of blood and iron, etc. German unification, taking, that Germany would be then a great power within the concert of Europe with France and the British Empire, Russia, etc. And the whole idea is one way of trying to talk about Nietzsche, because especially Nietzsche and politics, when we talk about politics and Nietzsche, we tend to always look at it through the lenses of the 20th century, right? The Nazis and all. It's like, well, Nietzsche wasn't writing in the 20th century. He was writing in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century. The main person there is really, for his own time, is Bismarck. So what is he saying about Bismarck's politics? And he says quite a lot, actually, and he's quite critical of it. He says, no, it's not great politics, not große Politik. It's actually an example of petty politics for the reasons I gave you earlier. Fragmentary, nihilism, nationalism, etc. But on that basis, then he said, no, but we should try to think about what a great politics for Europe would actually be. So hence the title of the book that tries to explore that with the view that, he does say certain things about politics. This is the context when it is said. This is the relationship to, or this is some of the ways you can think about the relationship with his philosophical ideas. And maybe that gives us a bit of a kernel of thinking about Nietzsche and politics, hopefully not necessarily a new kernel, but a kernel around which we can organize those thoughts rather than always think, oh, Nietzsche, Nazis, that's it. Try to change the point of that discussion.
Right. This book was actually, you've had a couple of conversations with presses that aren't normally interested in academic books, right? But which I'm very grateful is how I found you and then read it in an academic context. But that's because they identified that this is actually an important conversation to be having for the modern world. So are there ways that we haven't touched on yet that these sort of reflections that you do about Nietzsche and Bismarck are relevant or can help us reframe or rethink the sort of movements that we're seeing happening in our political landscape today?
Yeah, I mean, I think I already mentioned the kind of alt-right Richard Spencer thing, so I don't think I'll go back down that lane. There was some other stuff about, the populist moment, Trump. How can we think about, because a lot of people have talked about, well, is a lot of Trump's vote based on a certain resentment, right? And once you talk about resentment, then Nietzsche is not very far from the conversation once you have those kind of references. And yes, there's obviously ways in which resentment can help you understand some of what's going on, because a lot of it is a bit of that what we've just been talking about. A lot of it seems to be a bit about turning the clock back, trying to go back to something that was before. There's a bit of nostalgia for the past. The UK, a lot of the Brexit vote seems to be about, the British Empire and all these types of things, going back to then when we were independent from Europe. So a lot of it is about turning the clock back, resentment vis-a-vis what's happened in time. And that, so, when you know a bit of Nietzsche, that I think that can help you understand what's going on there. The other thing that was interesting was trying to think about how do you articulate the kind of Trump as a figure through some of the figures that you have in Nietzsche. And one of the ones that came to my mind, which I thought was kind of amusing, but perhaps made a point, was that at the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra has, having spent, X amount of years in this cave thinking about philosophy, decides, okay, I know what I know what I want to say now, and rejoins humanity and comes down from the cave, down the mountain, back into the marketplace again, and tries his new philosophical ideas and starts spouting his theories. And he's trying to teach the ubermensch, and everybody looks at him going, what the hell is this guy talking about? And they think it's a bit of a joke. And then he realizes, this isn't working. I'm going to do the opposite. Instead of teaching the ubermensch, I'm going to teach the opposite figure, the last man. And he says, look, I'll give you the last man. The last man is the person who just wants everything to be like, stay the way it is, just wants comfort, doesn't want to be challenged, et cetera, et cetera. And they love it. They lap it up. They think it's wonderful. They're like, yes, that's what we want. That's what we want, which is exactly obviously what the opposite of Zarathustra. But I was thinking, well, is that, even though this is obviously not what Zarathustra wants, nor indeed what Nietzsche was kind of advocating, is that kind of demagogic, kind of like speaking to the masses, giving them what they want, playing in those types of values and those types of fears, talking to the values of the last man, is that one way to try to capture what Trump was doing, actually? Because some of these discussions came out, the book came out in 2016. And I think there was something, it did give you a certain insight there in terms of trying to characterize some of these values, like the ones they associate with the last man, the last human being, all the elements of resentment that goes with it, that seems to be driving a lot of this politics. And also then the demagogical kind of counter to what he wanted, the demagogic aspect of Zarathustra, speaking to the masses and to the crowds, and peddling this kind of theory which is the opposite of what he wants, and this clear rejection of the ubermensch. Whether that was helpful as a way of trying to think about it, there's lots of ways of doing it, of course, but does it give you certain insights as to what was going on? And hopefully last man, herd morality, resentment does help give you certain views of trying to understand that.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's incredibly important. And when we look at a figure like Nietzsche, who was writing 150 years ago now, right? You realize that these, I don't want to say that history is important because we need to look back and see how it repeats itself. But there is a sense in which we learn that, human fear, it does often, is often associated with looking back and longing for, previous stability or previous greatness or what have you. And we are embedded in this discourse in which that is still present, right? It was present then and it's present now. And it will probably remain present unless we figure out what to do about it. But we haven't really.
No, and I don't know if we ever will. But it's that whatever that thing is, yes, manifests itself in different ways. And Nietzsche was aware of it as in his time. And I think that's obviously, Nietzsche was writing in the 19th century. The world is quite different in a lot of ways. But at the same time, you can see the continuities. And I think that's what's great with Nietzsche, is that was it the kind of intellectual tools he fashioned for himself to try and understand the world he was living in, whether those tools can still be useful for us today. I mean, we need to apply them ourselves. And obviously we don't have the type of intellect that Nietzsche had, but his legacy in many ways, as opposed to always thinking his legacy is going to be the Nazis, etc. It's like, well, no, there's all these great theories and these great notions, death of God, herd and master morality, etc. Do they still capture the world we live, or at least an extent of, and give us insight into the world we live in today? And the answer to that, I think, is yes. And then see what the type of parallels, as you say, fear is never going to go away. There's never going to be not be people who want to go back to a golden age, which was meant to be better. That's just going to keep coming back and back. I was always going to say the eternal return of fear, right? But if that's it, and Nietzsche wouldn't, I think, interestingly too, I don't think Nietzsche would want to say the aim is to try to get rid of that. That's as absolutist as what he's arguing against. The thing is to try to understand what it is and try to figure out, well, how can it be tamed in a certain way, or how can it be made in a slightly productive, which goes back to these articulation between the two. Nietzsche spent a lot of time. There's often when you talk about Nietzsche, and even in contemporary political theory, you talk about the agon. That's become quite agonistic politics. That's become quite something where the idea is conflict between different groups of people. And Nietzsche, there's a kind of canon of agonistic thinkers, of which Nietzsche features, but there's also Hannah Arendt and even sometimes Carl Schmitt. And Nietzsche's in there. But if you look at it from that perspective, Nietzsche has a clear view because it's a lot of work on the ancient Greek agon. He says, well, that was a structure that existed within which, even though there was competition, it was tried to be geared towards the better of the whole. And that's a different perspective to some contemporary agonistic theorists who think it must do with mutual respect. And these elements, Nietzsche, mutual respect, that wasn't really what he was thinking about. He wasn't thinking about individual values between those people who were going up against one another, rather than the structure which kind of made people interact in a certain way. And that's how, I think that's still helpful to try to think about, well, these things exist, but can you challenge them and can you channel them in a certain way? And the whole idea of Nietzsche, of, become who you are, or is to say, well, of course, there's ugly parts and there's nice parts of everybody. And his whole idea was to say, well, can you put that into an overall whole, which is beautiful, and put the ugly with the good? That's valid at the individual level. It's probably valid at the kind of, I don't know, group level, or whichever nation level, whatever you want to put it to. So these are all views, these are all kind of insights that he had from the work that he did, that I think when we think about them can still help us think about our own politics today.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a really good note to end on. And I am personally grateful, because I think I need to apply more of that agonistic lens to my own thinking about what to do about the death of God and work in the modern spiritual landscape. So thank you from me personally, and from everybody listening. Sure. This has been wonderful.
Well, thank you very much.
Do you have a Twitter? Is there anywhere people can find you?
Yes, I do have a Twitter, Hugo Drochon. I think it's at @Drochon. I'm on Twitter. Yes, I tweet sometimes, not always greatly, but I do a bit of that social engagement. Yes.
Lovely. It's funny when I interview people, in other parts of the world, they're like, yes, here's my Instagram and my Facebook and my Twitter and my Pinterest. But academics, I always just ask Twitter.
Twitter. I'm on Facebook too. That's fine. But I've resisted Instagram so far, I have to say.
Okay. Yeah, it's a whole other beast, and I'll complain about it after we hang up. So thank you, Hugo, and thank you everybody for tuning in. Please do get at either one of us on Twitter or any other social media platform if you have any questions. And I'm Stephanie Rupert. You know where to find me. So thank you again so much, Hugo. And I will talk to everybody else next week.
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you.